I'm Dennis Andrucyk. I have the distinct pleasure of trying to make 30 minutes worth of word charts about the budget sound exciting. And I will do everything I can to make that happen. Bobby Braun was originally on this calendar to make this briefing to talk about the NASA funding process. He couldn't make it today, so I will do my very best to fill in for him. In the right, there we go. And to make it even a little more boring, I just retired from the federal government and I have a couple of post-employment restrictions. I'm not going to go through each one of these things because trust me, that would take the full half hour. But I have, just to kind of give a brief intro, I have cleared my presentation through NASA Legal, so I am good to talk to you all. The one thing I can't do though is talk about specific projects that NASA engaged with anyone that was under my purview during the last year of my employment. So I'll be speaking at the highest level, but I can't talk to specific projects. And that's the only real limitation. By the way, when I just retired from NASA, I was the Goddard Center Director. Before that, I was the Deputy Associate Administrator for the Science Mission Directorate. And before that, I was a Deputy Associate Administrator for STMD, and I got to work with Walt, got to work with Jen, Chris, LK. Where's LK's back? By the way, LK is Lakaduva Kubendran, I believe. Is that somewhat close? Okay. And working with STMD, just a great group of folks, and it's just a pleasure to see you all again. Okay, to talk about the federal budget, the NASA budget in particular, and again, I'm going to try and make something boring sound exciting, so ask any questions you have along the way. But there's a lot of competition for the overall federal budget. I mean, a whole heck of a lot of competition for the federal budget each year. And I'll start with I'm going to get to these first couple of charts very quickly. I'm not going to talk to all of them. But the bottom line is the beginning of the federal budget process is the president proposes a budget and then Congress disposes that budget. So starting with the president, obviously the president has his cabinet, the vice president, and 15 agencies. Of the agencies that are on here, actually they're not on here, they are sub to these cabinets. NASA also works not just with the NASA budget, but through Commerce to NOAA to build the nation's weather satellites. NASA works with the Space Force, obviously under defense. NASA also works with USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, on Landsat missions for decades and decades, 50 years of collaboration there, which falls under the Interior. So NASA is very interested in some of these other agencies, and while there's competition for the federal budget, NASA does collaborate along the way in order to establish and continue that budget. And by the way, there's some factoids at the bottom along the way to try and make these sound a little more interesting. The first president's cabinet was back in March of 1789. It goes back quite a ways, the whole cabinet process, and it's established through the Constitution. The NASA, though, is an independent agency. It doesn't fall under one of those cabinet organizations. It is an independent agency. This is a listing of the key independent agencies. It's not all of them. You see NASA at the top right-hand side, but these are all the other federal agencies. And I put this up here only to let you know that, again, competition for the federal budget is fierce on a yearly basis. And when the budget is created, that is a consideration along the way. So when somebody says, hey, I need a budget increase, just recall that there's a huge amount of pressure on securing every individual dollar for that budget. This list does not include some other agencies like OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. That is a key organization, and in that the OMB gathers the input from all the federal agencies to create the president's budget request each year. It doesn't include the Office of Personnel Management. So yes, the organization that creates the NASA budget is fairly complex. The resources that are applied, and by the way, I'm going through these quickly because I want to get to the schedule and the meat of what the actual process is and where the folks in this room can influence it if you so choose to do so. But the appropriations, there are 12 appropriations that are bills that ultimately become law that fund every one of those agencies. You have to be appropriated through law. And that's the bottom bang box of this presentation, this page of the presentation. It is the budget and appropriations are actually called out in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9, and that's the exact language from the Constitution. No money shall be withdrawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And by the way, if you haven't read it recently, the Constitution is it's only 4 pages. Can you believe it? It's lasted this long, and it's really got all those little nuggets in it. But appropriations is key. That's the only way NASA or any federal agency gets any resources. And in order for the law to become law, it's got to be agreed to by both sides of the Congress, both the House and the Senate, which are not always controlled by the same parties. So that is a give and take process, and then has to be signed by the president. And I wasn't going to go through all this, but I do want to highlight that in the appropriations, the NASA budget comes under Commerce, Justice, and Science. And that is my next slide. Commerce, Justice, and Science, and you wonder, how are these grouped together? That is a process unto itself that could take another half an hour to go through, so I'm not going to go through all of those, but these are the direct competitors for NASA resources for the NASA budget. Under Commerce, I mentioned earlier the NOAA partnership, but Commerce maintains the budget for Census, USPTO, NOAA, and NIST. We're in the same group as Department of Justice, including FBI, Bureau of Prisons, Marshals, DEA, and the US attorneys. Finally, you see some of the other agencies, because the CJS is also CJS and related agencies, the title of this slide. That is the specific name for this subcommittee in Congress. But it also includes NSF, Legal Services Corporation, which is federal, and EEOC. So when it comes time to ask for more money, the first place they go to is CJS. And the members that make up CJS, or Commerce, Justice, and Science, the first thing they're going to think of is, I need to take resources away from somebody else if I'm going to give it to NASA, or give it to NSF, or give it to EEOC. So that's where some of the pressure on the federal budget comes from. And if someone asks for money during a year of execution and you can't get it from your own agency, this is the next stop. So keep that in mind if you're ever thinking about the NASA budget. How did NASA fare in CJS in the 2023 appropriations? This is the final appropriation that was signed into law. Of the $1.7 trillion discretionary resources for the federal government, by the way, and by the way, discretionary, that is not the full budget. The full federal budget is approaching $6 trillion, around $6 trillion. The discretionary represents about 1/3 of the overall federal budget. The rest are mandatory resources. That's Medicare, that is Social Security, and payment on the national debt. So that represents 2/3 of the federal budget. The rest of the 1/3 is this discretionary piece. And for the most part, I'm just going to give you some numbers to give you where NASA kind of fits in the overall federal portfolio, so you have an understanding of that. Those 12 bills for appropriations included, so about half of that discretionary budget goes to defense. That one line item, the one cabinet. The rest is divided amongst all the other agencies. So but the good news is, though, there is a 9% increase just over last year in the non-defense discretionary funding. And by the way, those of you who are taking pictures, I think these slides will be available to you. There's nothing sensitive here, so that you feel free to take all you want. But I think they'll be. I can ask Angela. These will be made available. Yes, these will be made available to you. There's, again, nothing sensitive here. I got most of this data from the web. I just, after years of working in the NASA budget, I know where to look for it. When it comes to the CJS within the federal budget, there's $84 billion of federal agency resources under CJS, which is an increase of $6 billion from 2022. And that represents almost an 8% increase in 1 year. I tell you what, when some folks think that some federal agencies, their budget's going down, NASA's is going up. And that's something to be really jazzed about, really excited about. I used to say flat is the new up. Unfortunately for the NASA budget, up is the new up. This is really great news. When it comes to the NASA appropriation, NASA in 2023, FY 2023, was allocated $25.4 billion. That's way cool, because NASA's doing a lot of great work with those resources. And that's an increase of $1.3 billion over 2022. It's exciting times. Represents, if you're interested, folks talk about what does NASA mean against the entire federal budget? Is it a big percentage? Is it a little percentage? It's kind of small. Against the entire federal budget, the discretionary resources, again, not Medicare, not Social Security, is about 1.5%. But against the entire federal budget, it's 0.5%. And that's kind of where it's been. If you look historically, NASA's typically been about 0.5% of the overall federal budget. The bad news is it hasn't grown a whole heck of a lot, but the good news is that the federal budget's been going up. So the NASA share has been increasing, and that is fantastic news. In the grand scheme of things, is when it comes to actually scheduling this, developing a federal budget for all of those agencies is complex and time consuming. It actually begins about 2 years, and I'll show you the details, before a fiscal year, before a year of execution. So we're in FY23, we call that the year of execution. The planning for 23 started 2 years ago, and I'm gonna give you some specifics on that. Strategic guidance from NASA headquarters proper to the mission directorates, to STMD, to SMD, to ESDMD, and SOMD, and Aero, that starts about a year and a half before the budget execution. So the planning takes a long time. Fortunately, you can leverage a lot of the work that had been done in prior years. But for new activities, new initiatives, you need to have those pretty much nailed a year and a half before the year of execution. And because it's such a complex process, because OMB ultimately has to gather all of that information, and then Congress has to disposition each one of those budgets. In the last 40 years, there's only been 4 cases where all of the 12 of those appropriations were signed before the fiscal year began. So it's not great news, but if I gave you that bullet alone, folks would walk away thinking, man, Congress isn't doing their job. But I didn't want you to have that impression. I want folks to know that it is a complex process. It is a very complex process. So it takes a while for Congress to make sure that all stakeholders have at least their minimum requirements met. And when an agreement can't be reached, when we do drop into a position where they're worried about getting an appropriation signed, they can do what's called an omnibus appropriation, where they take all the appropriations, they put it into one big bill, and they push the House and Senate negotiate that, and it's signed by the president. There's such a thing called a minibus, where they can agree on some of them, but not all of them. And they can do a minibus, which is part of a few of the appropriations bills coming together. But more often, what's used more often is a continuing resolution. I'm sure folks have probably heard about that before, but that is a temporary spending bill. And that's intended to fund the government for some incremental period of time while folks agree on the details of what the final appropriation should be. And when I say the final appropriation, we sometimes talk about there might be, and this is the last sub-bullet, a full year continuing resolution, but that's almost never used. I've not seen it. I've got a chart coming up next that'll actually show you where continuing resolutions are, and not one of them has ever been a full year CR. But the downside of a continuing resolution or CR is that they don't always provide all the funding you need. It's supposed to be an interim spending bill, so new starts don't happen, and it's incremental. You don't get all of the funding that you need. So that is problematic. So for the folks in STMD and elsewhere in the agency, when they're trying to get a year of execution going, it's delayed. You might spend those 2 years ahead of time getting all the details for a new start, only to find out you're in a continuing resolution and you can't get started on it for 3 or 4 months. And that happens on a somewhat regular basis. And finally, if there isn't a continuing resolution put in place at the beginning of the year, there is a partial, what's called a government shutdown. And then it's usually called a partial government shutdown, because you can't take out the TSA, you can't take out the FAA, and some of the capabilities that the taxpayer needs to operate. So we have been in cases, though, where there have been partial government shutdowns. I've lived through several of them. And I used to get excited and worried about those kind of things. I had family members that would say, wow, you don't have to work today. And then I'm going, but I'm not getting paid either. It is a very trying time for everyone in the federal service and those outside of the federal government, because you're worried about getting the resources you need in order to get your job done. That didn't go. All right, I'm not going to talk to all this because I'm already well into the time frame. But these are the CRs and continuing resolutions and shutdowns over the last 12, actually 13 years. As you can see, October 1st, the beginning of the fiscal year, is on the left-hand side. You see of the x-axis, and you see on the y-axis each of the fiscal years. There's never been an approved appropriation for all the federal agencies in the last since 1996, but in the last 12 years. Often you don't get an appropriation until January or February. So that is problematic for new starts. The overall budget process, this is straight out of NPR 9420.1a. I won't bore you with the details, but each one of these columns represents a part of the overall budgeting process. There's planning, programming, budgeting, and the execution. So this is a 3-year time span. 2 years of the planning and 1 year of execution. And I'll just highlight a couple of, and by the way, this is the process that NASA follows. It comes right out of a public document. Again, not sharing anything that's sensitive. But every federal agency does something similar, because in the middle of at the bottom of the second programming line, you see a PAIG, which is the Programmatic and Institutional Guidance. That's the agency getting ready to send the information to OMB. OMB gathers up every one of these requests from every federal agency and packages it. That package then comes into the final president's budget request, which for 2024, we just saw a couple of weeks ago. Nikki Fox did a presentation on the SMD portion of the NASA budget, but Bill Nelson did something for the overall NASA budget. The important part is the beginning box that is of interest is on the bottom of the left-hand side, the planning box. It's called the SPG, the Strategic Programming Guidance. That starts March, April of a year and a half before a fiscal year budget should be in place. That is the SPG, and I've got that coming up on another chart. The next key milestone is the OMB submit. Passback is when OMB says, hey, I got the inputs from everybody. Here's questions I have for you, NASA, or here's questions I have for you, federal agency X, Y, or Z. That's what the passback is all about, and there's usually not a lot of time to respond to those. So NASA has to turn that feedback back to OMB very quickly so they can get the president's budget request back to Congress. Excuse me, get the president's budget request back to OMB so they can get it back to the White House. Not going to go through this, but it's in the package for your own information. Again, you can pull this down from the web if you know where to look. Here's the president's budget request for FY24. The FY24 is not an approved number. It still has to go through the congressional process. But this is the ask. This is what NASA put into the request for OMB to put into the president's budget. Again, the president proposes, and now it's up to Congress to work this budget and get it ready for execution on October 1st. In particular, space technology currently for 2023 has a $1.2 billion appropriation, which is downright awesome. When I was in STMD back in 2015-16, the budget was, somebody can correct me, but it was at like over 600 million, but it's almost doubled in that time frame. That is fantastic news. If you think about the overall budget, STMD is doing great. In space and science, when I went over to science, it was 5.3 or $5.4 billion. And these days, it's the request is coming in at 8.2. But the appropriated for FY23 is 7.8 billion. So NASA investments has been doing very, very well over the years. Here's the overall budget process, and this is the ideal process for 2024. It started last year. So in March-ish of 2022, that SPG I talked about, which is the agency guidance, was sent out to the mission directorates. The mission directorates pull from the centers, they pull from others to get inputs over the summer of last year. Then in the early fall, late summer, early fall, NASA headquarters sends that request to OMB. OMB then does that passback I talked about a couple of minutes ago, where they have questions, because again, this isn't just, they're not just pulling from NASA, they're pulling from every federal agency. And when they have questions, and hey, they can't do this, they can't do that, those are the kind of questions that come back in the passback. And ultimately then that results in a president's budget, which comes out in the February-March timeframe. All this information in these budgets that are being prepared, because they're coming out in the president's budget request, they're embargoed. These are not numbers that are made public, but this is the process. I'm going to talk about from the president's budget on in just a couple of seconds. That's on the next slide. But I want you to know that the process for FY25, for example, is already underway. So if someone thinks they have an idea for a new start, please know that budget process has already begun. And I don't know that for a fact because I'm not part of the process right now. I'm now out of the federal government, but I'm willing to bet that has happened. Getting to a fiscal year budget approval, I just mentioned the president's budget request on the previous slide. It goes to each of those subcommittees. Those subcommittees are the appropriations subcommittees. For NASA, it's CJS. But all of those other subcommittees get the request in the president's budget for their agency. It goes from the subcommittee to full committee. Then there's ultimately a full committee vote in both the House and the Senate. Probably should have drawn two lines. for this because the House and the Senate go through independent processes. And at the very end, they come together and hopefully they have agreement. But you may hear in the news, well, the House budget for CJS is X and the Senate budget is Y. And they have to negotiate those before it goes to the president for signature. And that's usually the process where it slows down and we wind up in a continuing resolution. But once they dot those I's and cross those T's, the president then signs the bill into law and it becomes money for the for NASA. Now, ideally, that would be before the fiscal year starts on October 1st. But as you saw 2 or 3 slides ago, it hasn't happened that way for quite a while. But it is something we almost always get funded, with a few rare exceptions. We see NASA, I'm not with NASA anymore. Sorry, old habits are hard to break. But it is great to see that the NASA resources are going up each year. Other takeaways, and this is my last slide. If you have a request in year of execution, it's almost impossible to get that. I've had folks come into me with a great idea. Hey, Dennis, this is a wonderful idea. Can you go get us some resources for this? And the answer is no. It's almost, well, it's not always no, but it's really 99.9% of the time it's no, because every one of those dollars before we get them, before the NASA gets them, is spoken for. It is in that appropriation. It's in law. So in order to take that, to fund a new idea, it has to be taken away from somebody else, somebody that's already expecting it. And that's almost impossible to do. The first place you go to, if you can't get it from within NASA, is somewhere else in CJS. If not there, somewhere else in the federal government. And as you can imagine, that's not easy to do. To help accommodate for that, though, you'll see the NASA budget will include programmatic wedges. It'll be New Frontiers, it'll be Discovery, it'll be some of the programs and projects you just heard about from STMD, and I won't repeat them all, but those are programmatic wedges which allow the content to be flexed, shall we say, just a little bit. And that's where new competitions can come in and new ideas can be funded through those solicitations, through programmatic funding wedges. And that is a very, very important part of the overall budget. I talked about the give and take, so I won't really dwell on that, but it is a give and take process as you go through the original budget request through the agency with OMB and during the pass-back process. The first thing the agency does when the president's budget request comes out is every mission director, every center director goes and starts talking to their stakeholders on the Hill. That's the first thing I always did, was go talk to the stakeholders on the Hill about why the NASA budget is important. And that is really important to do. You'll also note that in some of the process during the congressional piece, a project may not even be in the president's budget request, but it may be inserted by Congress during the negotiations period from the president's budget request to the time a budget finally comes out. All right, and then getting off the stage here, the Andrucyk spin on the overall process is there's never enough resources and funding to make everyone totally happy. So if we can make everyone equally unhappy, or at least see that their basic requirements are met, touchdown. Because there's, again, only so many dollars to go around. And that's meant to be somewhat humorous because overall, the NASA budget has been going up. And I would very much like to tell all our stakeholders that everybody in this room, everybody that depends upon space and NASA resources should be grateful for that, because we've had bipartisan, the NASA has had bipartisan support for its projects for decades. And that's my getting off the stage chart. I should have a question, Q&A, yes. Comments, questions?
Thank you, Dennis, for the presentation. So in an effort to make sure we have enough time for people to get settled in the breakout rooms, we will gather up the list of Slido questions and send them to you, and okay. We'll get answers for folks. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.